Jujutsu Kaisen is a series full of lovable characters worthy of their own fans. Like my guy Todo, or everyone's favorite and my sometimes favorite, Gojo. I've heard many different people's picks for favorite character, yet I never hear anyone say it's the series' protagonist, Yuji Itadori. Most shonen's fan favorite character is usually either the main character, their rival, or like a really cool mentor. We can see this in the Naruto fanbase, for instance, with the most beloved characters being Naruto himself, Sasuke, or Kakashi. Dragon Ball's most beloved characters are Goku, Vegeta, and Piccolo. One Piece's top characters are Luffy, Zoro, and Shanks. I could probably think of more shonen that kind of fit this mold, but I don't want it to fall apart anymore. In Jujutsu, the favorite characters are Gojo, Megumi is an rival, and Gojo. You might think I'm just joking calling Gojo the MC, but I'm not. Gojo, both in a narrative sense and within the context of this story setting, is basically the main character. Like a main character should, he drives the plot, has the most way in what happens, other characters react to his decisions and grow based on whether or not he achieves a victory or suffers a defeat, and this goes for both the hero side and the villain side. Typically, a main character and a protagonist are one and the same, but I think Yuji is still the heart of the story, so he retains the protagonist title to me. In contrast to Gojo, Yuji doesn't really have much power in the story to push the narrative in any one direction. The plot happens to him and he changes throughout the events at the whims of the author's pen. Yuji may influence other characters to change, but in mostly minor ways that don't influence the plot all too much. Yuji can straight up disappear from the story for episodes at a time, and at this point, it feels natural to the audience. When you describe him like this, he sounds more like a side character, but I believe that's what makes Yuji work as a protagonist of this story. Before we get started, subscribe, like this video, comment, and share this video with a friend who likes Jujutsu Kaisen video essays. Yuji is what you would call a reactive protagonist. A reactive protagonist is one, as my first Google result so eloquently puts, reacts to what's happening to them. Whoa. Think of superheroes. A villain needs to exist within the story for anything to really get going for many of these characters. Batman and most of his stories would fit this mold, as his villains are oftentimes heavily orchestrating the plot that Batman needs to figure out. Reactive protagonists really need an electric personality to hit it off with the audience, especially if among the cast of characters there exists someone with traits of an active protagonist, like Gojo. On first glance, Yuji doesn't seem to be all too different from the standard shonen fare of the not-so-bright, kind, good boy variety. However, his standout trait is that he's basically Spider-Man. He embodies the "with great power comes great responsibility" line of thinking since his grandpa died and throughout the story. All he aims to do is just help people. Just making sure that before he dies that he made a positive impact within the Jujutsu world and ultimately the greater world which he protects. Unfortunately, the Jujutsu world he resides in is one that makes that extremely hard. In a story with a thematic focus on death and how corrupt institutions can affect people and even break them, it's genius to have someone like Yuji be the story's vessel to show what can happen to people that just want to help out. An aspect of Yuji's character that allows the effects of the life of a sorcerer to be properly conveyed is his innocence. From the very beginning, one of Yuji's key traits has been his naivete to the complicated and tough aspects of life. In the first chapter/episode, his grandpa prepares to tell him about his parents and he stops him from doing so. While it's sweet in a way that Yuji doesn't care to know, as his grandpa is the only parental figure he cares about, it shows from really early on that Yuji is simple-minded and doesn't care to make his life potentially more complex than he feels it needs to be. Growing up without either parent and seemingly never caring to find out why they weren't in his life is interesting behavior for sure. Not too long after that, his grandpa dies, and he has literally never had to go through the grieving process of a death ever. More than any other character in this series filled with teenagers and some adults who aren't even all that old, Yuji embodies a youthful perspective on life, similar to that of the target audience that shonen is marketed towards. Due to Yuji's trademark innocence, he eats a Sukuna finger and has unwillingly been thrust into a very adult world, the Jujutsu world, which is one characterized as heavily abiding by rules and a culture that's dehumanizing and uncaring to the individuals that keep it afloat, and by association, the rest of Japan. Yuji is a metaphor for a kid or an optimistic person entering into a corporation with a bad work culture in real life, or just someone being forced to tackle adult issues far too early in life due to a fundamentally broken society, which is something that many can relate to across the world these days. Nanami says as much. Nanami, who views Yuji as a successor in ideology as to what an ideal Jujutsu sorcerer should be like, believes there's certain morally nebulous actions that should strictly be for the adults, but because of the nature of the sorcerer's occupation, a teenager like Yuji has to fight for his life at the request of faceless adults who would rather see him dead and is forced to kill others, which goes completely against his kind-hearted nature. Yuji wants to save everyone he can with the power he has, but sometimes saving people in this story is putting them out of their misery. We have to focus a bit on his ideology in regards to saving everyone, as this is where his naivete comes into play the most. He wants to save everyone he can, no matter the quality of their character. This isn't a bad trait to have, but because saving anyone indiscriminately is simpler and the more obviously moral ideal to have compared to Megami's, which is saving those he deems a good person, it again shows how Yuji functions as a person. His ideas about the world and about himself are innocent and easily broken down just by simply living in this cruel world. Holding on to his simplistic convictions requires more internal strength than he could have ever have been prepared for. His ultimate teacher in constantly showing how little power he has is the demon inside of him, Sukuna. When Yuji doesn't have control of his own body, suddenly he has a ton of narrative weight. Well, his body does. Side note, the main antagonist of the series never even refers to Yuji by his name, he's just Sukuna's vessel, and using him is only a backup plan. The disrespect to Yuji is crazy in this story. If Sukuna is on screen, the audience knows something major is going to happen. Sukuna has literally murdered Yuji, given him immunity to Yuji's own personal antagonist, Mahito's domain expansions, kills Jogoat, and is responsible for the deaths of a vast number of people in Shibuya. The possibility that Sukuna would kill a ton of people while he's not in control had been there since the start of the series. Yuji, however, had never really entertained the possibility of his body being used by a nefarious third party. I don't think anyone could have guessed Yuji would be fed like 20 fingers at once, so I'll give him some slack for this, but Yuji wasn't the brightest for running into enemy territory alone. Definitely written as a piece of foreshadowing. Megami even said that wasn't the brightest idea, but Yuji just wants to help any way he can, so he runs off bright-eyed as ever. This guy could have ran into Jogo, Hanami, Dagon, or even Kenjaku possibly. This leads to my favorite fight in the series though, so I'm glad he did that. Since he's the protagonist of a shounen series, I should talk about his appeal in a fight, and I think Yuji vs Choso exemplifies his the best by far. But we have to think about Yuji's track record first. Unlike most shonen MCs, Yuji doesn't really have many major victories to call his own. So going through season 1 material, he lost to a teddy bear, got slaughtered by a special grade on his first mission, got sucker punched by another teddy bear, kinda won against Mahito, but it turned into a 2-on-1, so I don't know if that counts. He got his head kicked in by Todo, then became his brother, and drove Hanami into a corner, then defeated 2 curse wombs in a tag team fight with Nobara. No real solo victories here. The only key fight he had before coming across Choso was a grasshopper that was semi-grade 1 at least, and the grade 1 predator specifically bigged Yuji up for being able to take it down so easily. This fight is important purely for power scaling, or in other words, to show the audience that Yuji is actually powerful even on his own. Like sure, Yuji still doesn't have a domain expansion, but if he's up against most opponents who are just more so physical fighters with simpler abilities, it's a safe bet now that he would win. And what do you know? Choso is an enemy who just has a simple yet powerful curse technique, blood manipulation, and relies on hand-to-hand combat. Perfect for a potentially hype fight for our MC. Now up to this point, Choso had just been this background character who was given the simplest motivation of all, to want to kill Yuji. Revenge for his brothers, which is understandable, but his lack of focus after his very quick introduction made him seem like he wouldn't be a big deal for us, the audience, to really worry about. Choso was introduced with little gravitas, just being shown to us for the first time playing a game with the other villains in chapter 62, and then appeared again 20 chapters later in the Shibuya incident next to 2 characters we know very well, and is given orders by Jogo while facing Gojo. A person experiencing this story for the first time would assume that he's strong, but not that strong, since he's getting yelled at like a henchman. For those who hadn't rewatched the anime or brushed up on their knowledge since season 1 ended nearly 2 years ago, Choso would seem even less noteworthy. He also has no combat feats before this fight to think of, so there's no reason to think of him as a threat either. Jujutsu loves to give us a false sense of security all the time though. Yuji happens to hop down a train station staircase where Choso was just standing at like a boss battle, and immediately, our sense of security was shattered. Likewise, Yuji's arm was shattered. Our MC starts up this fight terribly. If this happened to a side character, we'd probably give up on them, but because our protagonist is built differently, and the very fact that he's the protagonist, we don't think he'll lose regardless. One arm almost useless? That's just a handicap. That'll make his eventual win even more satisfying. He'll pull through. The fight progresses. Choso says his basic revenge fuel spill to Yuji. Choso appears so one-dimensional in this fight compared to our fleshed-out MC that it makes a victory seem even more inevitable. Unfortunately, Choso's ability is not one-dimensional. It covers all bases. Long range, mid-range, close quarters combat, so the fight is still definitely going to be hard fought. Yuji is stumped on how he's going to deal with it, but luckily he has an oh so convenient AI in his ear to tell him a strategy on how to counteract Choso's blood manipulation. The perks of being protagonist, unearned help. Luring Choso into a bathroom with the sprinklers turned on to prevent him from using his blood, Yuji proclaims that Choso is on his turf now. The fight finally feels like it's on an even playing field, and thus begins the wettest and hottest fight between two men in a bathroom you'll ever see in your life. Yuji is literally said to be one of the best sorcerers when it comes to throwing hands, so it's only a matter of time before he wins. So, Choso created a new blood technique on the fly, Blood Meteorite, completely hidden from Yuji and our eyes, resulting in the low point of the fight. Having a hole in an arm was bad enough, but in a place where Yuji so expertly describes as a place where something vital shouldn't have been broken, is a death blow. Ordinarily, the fight would end here since Yuji's fate in this fight is legitimately sealed here, except main characters are the exception, especially in a shounen. In anime, the protagonist can get a hole blown right in their stomach, have two broken arms, have one hand clean blown off, or be on their borderline deathbed, but it won't matter because of their never give up attitude. And the story beat that follows showcases exactly that. Even more, Yuji has a character revelation. In an almost meta way, Yuji realizes that he doesn't have to perform the stereotypical protagonist role of saving his teacher, Gojo. Now he's really just one guy that's just aiming to make a difference, however small. He describes himself as just one cog in the machine that is this grand sorcerer v curses conflict. When I read this for the first time, I thought, oh wow, a protagonist that realizes he's not the main character in his own world story is so interesting, and that because he just had a breakthrough, there was no way he'd lose now. If a protagonist learns a lesson or something about himself, then it's always courage for the opponent they're facing. Yuji shrugs off the giant hole in his abdomen and keeps fighting, even harder than before, and that arm that Choso and the viewer thought was practically useless? Yeah, the author, via Yuji, subverts our expectations by having his ultimate deciding attack come from that arm. This would tie the fight's very beginnings all the way to the end. It would be poetic and a perfectly hyped way for Yuji to defeat this character that had no business putting up this much of a fight. Alas, Choso subverts our expectations again by blocking that punch and then slicing like Yuji's whole shoulder in two, and giving a punch of his own, ending the fight. Some MCBS does ultimately save Yuji from being downright killed here, but it doesn't take away from just how shocking it was that our protagonist lost to such a random character. He didn't even get to do his run back on his arch nemesis yet. I think this fight encapsulates exactly why Yuji works so well as a protagonist for Jujutsu Kaisen. It's a series where the unfairness of life and its systems rear its ugly head constantly. In this story's world, and much like our own, a few are guaranteed an easier life. Many become jaded. Some revel or even excel in its challenges. Others find no meaning in putting their lives on the line for a thankless society. And others like Yuji keep it pushing, regardless of what they're doing has a direct and tangible meaning or impact. He is the brightest character, so he can best show what being exposed to the ills of society will do to a person. No matter how high your moral standards are, no matter how well intentioned you are, or no matter how important you think you'll be. He shows that life can truly be exceptionally cruel and tough to all, even if you literally are the protagonist. Now, at the end of the Shibuya arc, Yuji kinda belittles his existence as he is now kinda sorta responsible for the deaths of thousands after Sukuna ran around his body when he was knocked out after the Choso fight, but like, an internal battle against self-worth issues? Oh, he got that. Anyway, subscribe so I can feel more motivated to upload more than twice a year, like the video, please leave a comment, and share this video with a friend who likes Jujutsu Kaisen and video essays. And before I go, I'm going to try something new for how I end these videos. And that's just an analysis, a bruh analysis. Thanks for watching.